All right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I just want to ask for the members that are joining us, if you can please enter your name, your email, and the agency or organization that you represent in the comments. Also, please remain on mute while the speakers are speaking. So welcome again to everyone to our January general meeting. New York City VOAD is a nonprofit and coalition of 40+ New York City-based nonprofits partnered with government agencies on the city, state, and federal level that come together to share resources to support New York City during disasters. My name is Racine Droz. I am the Senior Director of Safety and Emergency Response at City Harvest, and I co-chair New York City VOAD with my colleague, Zach Hodgson, he just waved. And he is our Director of Emergency Services at the Salvation Army. Just to provide a workflow of what to expect for this discussion. So we'll be starting off with introducing our 3 guest speakers. And then we're going to open it up for Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to put it in the chat. We do have Josh Morton, who is assisting us with the camera, and we'll also be reviewing the questions as they come in, and we'll be saving it for the end. So to kick it off, January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So human trafficking is a form of modern slavery that occurs in every state, including New York. The National Human Trafficking Hotline works closely with service providers, law enforcement, and other professionals in New York to serve victims and survivors of trafficking, respond to human trafficking cases, and share information and resources. In 2023, statistics reported New York City was amongst the 10 worst states for human trafficking. The others, California, Texas, Florida, Michigan, Ohio, Georgia, Illinois, Missouri, and Mississippi. Today, we'll be hearing from our esteemed speakers directly connected to this work to bring awareness to this issue happening in our city. I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers, where we'll hear directly from them, their experiences, and receive tips on how to identify and respond to human trafficking in our city. So I'd like to start with providing you a bio of our 3 speakers. Starting with Darren McCormack, is the Deputy Special Agent in charge at Homeland Security Investigations, HSI. Sec McCormack currently serves as a Deputy Special Agent in charge of Homeland Security Investigations, New York Field Office. In this executive level position, Mr. McCormack provides operational oversight of all investigative and administrative functions of the HSI personnel operating within the National Security and Public Safety Division. Additionally, as the operational commander of HSI, New York's SRT and crisis negotiation team, Mr. McCormack leads both highly trained units equipped to resolve critical and high-risk operations involving a threat to public safety, which would otherwise exceed the capabilities of traditional law enforcement operations. Previously, Mr. McCormack oversaw HSI New York's El Dorado Task Force, Cyber Division, dedicated to combating financial crimes, fraud, and leading cyber intrusion, cryptocurrency forensics, and dark web investigations. As the Assistant Attaché for HSI, Attaché Vienna, Austria, from 2014 to 2018, Mr. McCormack was the lead diplomatic and law enforcement representative for the U.S. government on all DHS equities related to multilateral international cooperation, criminal investigations, and U.S. national security in Central Eastern Europe. Mr. McCormack has presented with multiple HSI directors awards and has received numerous foreign and domestic awards and recommendations. Next, we have Arrizu Sirjani, is a policy advisor at the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. Arrizu Sirjani is where she works with the city agencies and partners to implement various policies and initiatives. Prior to joining ENDGBV, Arrizu was the Senior Know Your Rights Project Coordinator at the New York Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, where she worked with community-based organizations to educate immigrant New Yorkers on their rights during immigration enforcement actions and assessing city services. Arrizu previously worked at Viren Life Plus, the White House, National Iranian American Council, Commission on Security and Cooperation in Europe, and U.S. Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. She has a master's in international security with concentrations in diplomacy and Middle Eastern studies from Sciences Po Paris, and individualized bachelor's in re-evaluating foreign policy, culture perspectives on strategic security and women's rights in the Middle East from the Johnson Center for Integrative Studies at the University of Redlands. We have Daria Viddler, a social worker with the Anti-Trafficking Project at Safe Horizon. Daria has their master's in social work where they studied clinical practice with individuals, group, and families. They have around 5 years of experience in working with youth and young adults in community centers. In more recent years, Daria uses trauma-informed counseling and client-centered practice in their previous work, providing psychotherapy and currently providing short-term counseling and case management to victims of human trafficking. So that's those are the bios of our three amazing speakers. And I would just like to kick it off for our panel. So let's kick it off to Zach McCormack to speak on the current landscape of human trafficking in New York City from a federal lens. I think we have you on mute.
Do you want to go to another panelist while that gets worked out and come back?
Sure. Did you want to try another device, Zach McCormack? Okay. All right, so what we can do is while you set that up, we can pivot to our next speaker, Arrizu. So let's just pull up the presentation. Excellent. So I'll hand it off to Arrizu, who will be speaking on the work that the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence is doing.
Thank you so much. Excuse me. Hi, everyone. My name is Arrizu Sirjani. I use she, her pronouns. I am a policy advisor at the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence. You'll hear me reference it as NGBV throughout the presentation, so just wanted to note that now. One of the things that I work on at NGBV is coordinating our office's work with asylum seekers and recently arrived migrants, which includes human trafficking. So with that, I'm going to get started. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I just wanted to first start by going over some terms and the definitions that we use in our work at NGBV. Next slide, please. So as mentioned, the following definitions are those that we use at NGBV in our work. So human trafficking is the use of power and control to force, defraud, or coerce someone into engaging in labor or services, including commercial sex or sexual activity. Traffickers use tactics including violence, emotional manipulation, and psychological threats, often exploiting social economic inequity for their benefit. And human trafficking, as mentioned, is an umbrella term which can encompass both sex and labor trafficking. And it's rooted in power imbalances where, again, one person is using their power to force another into performing labor or sex acts for the profit of the trafficker. Next slide, please. So sex trafficking or commercial sexual exploitation is when a person or entity recruits, transports, or houses a person for the purposes of performing forced, or involuntary sex acts in return for payment or benefit. If the trafficked person is younger than 18, the commercial sexual activity need not involve force, fraud, or coercion. And labor trafficking is when a person or entity exploits people for labor or services through force, fraud, coercion, debt repayment, or other forms of power or control. Next slide, please. So one of the things I just wanted to share to kind of talk, because we talked about and mentioned power imbalances, is the wheel of power and privilege. And so the wheel of power and privilege illustrates that the closer you are to power, the more privileged you are, and the further from you are from power, the more marginalized you are. And most of us have identifiers that grant us power and marginalization at the same time. And so mentioned, unequal power can come from social, cultural, gender norms and expectations, which includes violence between people of the same sex or gender, or situational power imbalances and inequities. And again, the reason that I want to just kind of highlight this is that those most vulnerable to exploitation through trafficking are those from oppressed or stigmatized communities, with many victims holding multiple marginalized identities. And it's also important to note that any situation in which people are displaced, such as natural disasters or migration or seeking asylum, people are more vulnerable to human trafficking. And we work to address this and take it into account in all of our work on human trafficking. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go briefly into an overview about the work of our office before going more specifically into our work on human trafficking. Next slide, please. So our office was created in 2001 when New York City residents voted to amend the city charter to establish a permanent office that would comprehensively address issues of domestic violence. And it was called the Mayor's Office to Combat Domestic Violence. In 2018, that office became the Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence via the Mayoral Executive Order 26. Through doing so, it acknowledged the connection between domestic violence and other forms of interpersonal violence in the lives of survivors, broadened the scope of the office's work, and enabled NGBV to invest in and offer more diverse programs and resources to survivors, people who cause harm, and communities. Next slide, please. So our main goals, our mission and goals, our office develops policies and programs, provides training and prevention education, conducts research and evaluation, performs community outreach, and operates the NYC Family Justice Centers. We collaborate with city agencies and community stakeholders, including survivors, to ensure access to inclusive services for survivors of domestic and gender-based violence. And this includes investing in non-mandated programs for people who cause harm. Other NGBV offerings include housing safety and stability programming and youth-focused violence prevention programming. Thank you. So we have multiple departments within NGBV. These are just a few of them. But so we have our New York City Family Justice Centers and programs, which includes citywide housing programs and survivor engagement initiatives. I'm going to go more into the work of the Family Justice Centers momentarily. We also have our External Affairs and Community Initiatives department. The community initiatives work include public engagement, outreach, and additional community-based programs. And then also they work on communications and media. A research and training team conducts reports, research, and analyzes data, as well as develops and facilitates training to city agency staff and other organizations and entities. And then we have our intergovernmental and legislative affairs team, which is the one that I'm on. We work with the legislature, and other elected officials' offices on policy. And we also participate and oversee different task forces and working groups, which I'll also touch on later. And all of these departments work on human trafficking, which now I'll go into. Next slide, please. So NGBV works on human trafficking in a variety of ways across teams. One of the roles that we hold is to coordinate across stakeholders. So we do this by providing services and support through the NYC Family Justice Centers, overseeing the city agency human trafficking working group, and participate in various task forces and working groups such as the Brooklyn DA's Human Trafficking Task Force. And then per our mandate, NGBV is entrusted to develop policies and initiatives, which includes on topics such as human trafficking. We also create resources and materials. An example of this is our work on human trafficking among recently arrived migrants, which we created new materials for, and I'll go into that in a little bit. Next slide, please. So our family justice centers, there is one in each borough. Each borough's family justice center connects survivors of domestic and gender-based violence and their children to services. The FJCs are walk-in centers that provide a safe and caring environment, and all services are voluntary, free, confidential, and provided regardless of immigration status, language, the language spoken, income, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, and disability. And then on the right of this slide are the addresses and phone numbers for the FJC locations. Next slide, please. So there are a variety of services on this slide that are offered at the FJCs. I'm not going to go through all of them. I'm going to highlight some, but the one thing that I do want to mention is that these services are accessible to survivors of trafficking. So one of the ones that I particularly want to highlight is our work on U and T visas. We also have risk assessment and safety planning, case management, immigration legal assistance, assistance with filing police reports, and individual and group counseling for adults and children. So we have on-site partners at the FJCs. So our community partners, each FJC has 30 to 40 community-based organizations that provide services on-site, including culturally specific and accessible services. And we also work with city agency partners. So, before going into the city agency partners, just want to mention about our community partners is that they vary by FJC, and they reflect the demographics and needs of that borough. So city agency partners, we work with the DA's offices. Our FJCs are co-located with DA offices in each borough. The district attorney offices provide social services through a victim assistance unit. The NYPD, there's a specially trained plainclothes domestic violence prevention officer on site, which assists with filing police reports and obtaining police paperwork. Excuse me. NYC Human Resources Administration helps troubleshoot public assistance and emergency grants administered by the administration. NYC Health and Hospitals provides clinical services, including psychotherapy, psychiatric evaluations. And then the NYC Sheriff's Department, which facilitates process services for family court orders of protection and other related court summons, removals pursuant to court orders, mental health warrants, and arrests in some cases. Next slide, please. Thank you. I just wanted to highlight some resources that are available. So NYC Hope is the city's online resource directory for information and resources about gender-based violence, which includes intimate partner violence, family violence, elder abuse, sexual assault, stalking, and human trafficking. And there is a link there that will be shared following the meeting on how you can access it. And it brings together resources and searchable services from across NYC. Then there's also the 24/7 domestic violence hotline, the New York State Office for the Prevention of Domestic Violence has a text line, and then NYC Well, which can be contacted from call, text, or through an online chat. Next slide, please. I think, sorry. Okay, sorry. My computer froze for a second. So as mentioned, one of the things that our office does is oversee the city agency human trafficking working group. So the purpose of the working group is to help coordinate the city's response to human trafficking, which includes both sex and labor trafficking, to learn from each other, to support efforts and collaborate across agencies strategically, and to align prevention, identification, and intervention efforts and create more consistent messaging across city agencies. And then before getting into some of our work regarding the migrant crisis and human trafficking, just a few things that I wanted to note. Firstly, that while migrants are particularly vulnerable, the issue of human trafficking is not new to New York City or limited to migrants. The current migrant crisis has made it more visible in many cases for many people. There's a need for coordination across providers, government entities, and CBOs to address the situation, especially given challenges related to immigration, such as the lack of access to public benefits. And then, sorry, you may see my cat join for a second, I apologize. And then lastly, that there is a strong importance of prevention and general awareness raising across communities, including through Know Your Rights work, which is something that we touch on. Next slide, please. Thank you. So NGBV coordinates across stakeholders to help identify, respond to, and prevent human trafficking among recently arrived migrants in survivor-centered, trauma-informed, and culturally and linguistically responsive ways. Some of our work that we've been doing includes creating one-pagers on labor and sex trafficking to help address concerns raised by city agencies and CBOs around sex and labor trafficking to help recently arrived migrants be more aware of their rights and potential risks in a way that is not threatening and lets them just know what provides them with information to know their rights. We also have established a referral pathway to one of our contracted legal service providers to assist migrants with UNT visas, among other immigration relief options. With the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, we coordinate across ACS, NYPD, and DA's offices for UNT visa meetings. And then additionally, we have been conducting trainings for staff at emergency sites, including trainings on human trafficking and trauma responsive practices, particularly for, as I said, the different emergency sites, such as previously Navigation Center and different shelters. And that's actually it for me. That's the last slide. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Arrizu, and we're so honored to have you speak with us, and thank you for the work that you and your organization does. I just want to pivot. Zach McCormack, I believe his equipment is working now, so I will transition over to him to be able to share the landscape of human trafficking in New York City from a federal lens. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. How's my audio now? Thumbs up? Good?
Excellent.
Excellent. Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody, for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with everyone this morning. I know it was a wordy bio, and I thought that was just going to be posted somewhere. In one line, I'm the Deputy Special Agent in charge for Homeland Security Investigations here in New York. My portfolio is responsible for national security and public safety. We are a global agency. We're federal, so we are the largest criminal investigative component of the Department of Homeland Security. We have about 10,000 employees, about just under 7,000 special agents, representing about 47 criminal investigative platforms. We are in 93 countries with 56 offices in 93 countries across the globe. So really our mission, straightforward, is national security and public safety. And as was mentioned earlier today, we're talking about human trafficking and exploitation. January is Human Trafficking and Human Trafficking Awareness Month. So it's a great opportunity for us as an agency, and for me is specifically to get in front of an audience not within the government, because the partnership with NGOs and the public is so critical to us in our mission, because often enough the federal government is viewed as specifically a law enforcement function, which we are, but we're public servants, and specifically as it relates to human trafficking and child exploitation, those are two missions that we take very seriously, and personally, I get a lot of gratification out of facilitating and being a part of conversations like this, whether we're bringing awareness to or really investigating and bring criminals to justice who perpetrate human trafficking and or any kind of exploitation, whether it's labor or the sex trade. They're heinous crimes, really bad people doing really bad things, and so it's very important to us. I think a couple notes as I talk through who we are and what we do. I don't have a PowerPoint. I was going to kind of freestyle this. Hopefully this turns into more of a conversation than it is a presentation. So at any point, please feel free to put your hands up. Any engagement, I think, is more productive for everybody. But last year, one statistic that stands out to me is last year it's estimated that globally, roughly 27 million people, men, women, and children, were exploited on a daily basis. So the world we live in now, obviously with the internet, we have access to everything at any time. The downside of that is people have access to us at anywhere, at any time. And as we know, and we talk about things like human trafficking, again, whether it's sex or labor, forced labor, it knows, the victims know no boundaries, men, women, children, of ages, genders, identities, everything. There's no limitation to the potential victims. So one thing that the previous presenter mentioned, our investigations as it relates to human trafficking are victim-centered or centric. So we focus as much as our effort is on investigating and arresting the criminals, we have an equal amount of focus on assisting the victims. And really often enough, identifying victims is where our investigations start, which is why in a recurring theme during my presentation or while I'm talking will be that often enough law enforcement, victims don't want to come forward for any number of reasons. Shame, often fear of getting in trouble, because often during their exploitation, they're forced to do criminal activity or forced into criminal activity. So reporting themselves, there's always a fear, certainly immigration status, fear of deportation, and I'm going to dispel that as we move through some of the topics of my conversation. So this engagement with the audience here and any kind of NGO or any kind of private sector partner is critical to the success of our mission, because you all build the bridge between us and the victims' families. So as HSI and our investigators and our victim assistance program become a trusted member to you and your teams, it makes it easier for folks who encounter victims or more likely to encounter victims, like the Red Cross or the Department of Education or hospital services or religious institutions. As we bring awareness to who we are and what we do in the realm of human trafficking and child exploitation, investigations, and victim assistance, we count on basically your referrals of victims to us as trusted resources, that they're not going to be prosecuted for any crimes. They're not going to be deported if they're here illegally. Our sole function will be to investigate the crimes, bring those perpetrators to justice, but also provide as much assistance as possible, which also these conversations and these engagements, they build our partnership so that when we come across victims and we encounter them and we are trying to assist, we develop a broader network of points of contact that we can put the victims in contact with and their families to help them in their rehabilitation process. So partnership, that's a recurring theme that I'll be talking about. So let's talk about, there are a few topics, migrant crisis being one of them. Right now, an unprecedented time for a migrant crisis. I happen to be, as my bio mentioned, I was in Vienna, Austria as the assistant attaché in 2015 when Europe was experiencing its own migrant crisis, and now we're experiencing a multiplied version of that on the southwest border. And so right now our border is like a sieve, unfortunately. And so people are fleeing their countries all over the world to come to the United States, claiming asylum for a better life. The problem with that is, and Amnesty International estimates, the problem is there's a ton of vulnerability. There's so many people without resources, without protection, without money, without language skills, without technology, who are coming across the border. And it makes them vulnerable to cartels and crime syndicates whose sole profit comes from the exploitation, forced labor, and trafficking of anybody. Doesn't matter age, doesn't matter country, doesn't matter race, gender, anything. They're just vulnerable. And so these crime syndicates prey on the weak, but also the migrants amongst themselves. Amnesty International estimates that 6 in 10 migrant women and girls experience some sort of sexual violence during their journey into the United States. So it's more 60% of the women and children coming across the border for however long their travel is will encounter some sort of sexual violence, which is a huge problem. And it leaves us as law enforcement at a huge deficit because for especially now at this time, with the amount of people coming across the border, resources, law enforcement and security resources are stretched thin because we're taken away to some degree, taken away from our primary mission of investigating crimes to offer support to the people who are coming across the border. And that support is as simple as housing, feeding, blankets, bathing, food, helping mothers take care of their young. So not only are the people coming across the border vulnerable, but law enforcement and really national security is vulnerable as well. So we make a commitment to use our resources and our authorities to protect all migrants, regardless of how they arrived in the country. And now we've seen an uptick here in New York, and that continues to rise. So, we commit our resources and our authorities to helping the migrants. And we do this, there's a diverse group of people coming across the border. Again, I can't speak enough, and the previous presentation touched on it. Race, gender, sexuality, any sort of community. We cut across all cultures, all identities to assist anyone who is victim of this. And really, at the end of the day, partnership is most important to us. Another area of vulnerability is natural disasters. When people are displaced anywhere in the world, natural disasters, they're displaced, they're left without resources, they are vulnerable. And there's always somebody waiting and willing to take advantage of these people who are vulnerable. So again, during a natural disaster, government resources are stretched thin, and unfortunately, investigations for more acute crimes like child exploitation or human trafficking, they take away the resources from law enforcement. So again, regardless of how vulnerable people are, it's the partnership that HSI has with the public that we encourage both our partners, again, the audience here, our private and public partners, NGOs that we work with, to encourage the people who have encountered some sort of exploitation to come forward without fear of prosecution, without fear of deportation. I can't stress that enough. I mentioned earlier some of the industries that we work with. Board of Education here in New York. We've done some work with the mayor's office, who we'll hear from. The hospitality industry and religious institutions. Hospitality industry is huge. So again, the outreach and the partnership that we do is focused on bringing awareness to the problem, but also offering training where we can. And I know one of my colleagues will talk about some of the signs to look for human trafficking or some sort of exploitation. What I can tell you is that the problem is everywhere. It's here in New York. It's like I said, the stat that I mentioned before, 27 million people every day across the globe. This problem has no boundaries. And I think, unfortunately, what we find is that because it's such a sensitive topic and because human beings and humanity is really threatened by this sort of crime, it sometimes or often enough, unfortunately, becomes an unpopular topic to discuss, because it is such a sensitive subject matter, and because either older people or children are victims. It's a tough subject to stomach. It's a tough thing to think about. It's a tough thing to hear about. It's a tough thing to look at pictures or any sort of media on the subject matter. So sometimes it's easier for people to sort of turn a blind eye because it's sort of like a path of least resistance, and it's just uncomfortable. But I think, again, constantly talking about the subject and constantly talking about how much on a scalable level this is a problem is very important. So again, for us, we do outreach to the healthcare industry. We talk to hospitals here in New York and across the country, and in our international offices, we partner with the host country governments to bring awareness to them, because often enough in the less developed countries, money and resources, training, facilities, even medical equipment is lacking. And the one thing that the U.S. does very well, and I don't think we give ourselves enough credit for, is in developing countries, we do bring a lot of resources as far as healthcare and even law enforcement and intelligence to those countries to augment where they are deficient. So there's constant training and outreach, again, in the hospital industry. And then I think really to close out is this is cross-cultural. And again, this issue is a global problem that we here in New York see a lot of, but we're seeing more of it because people are being displaced. And as I mentioned, and we're well aware that now buses buses are now being not allowed to come into New York, and they're going to New Jersey because of the numbers, the sheer volume of folks that are coming into New York alone. And that's not limited to New York. It's Chicago, it's Los Angeles, it's Miami, some of the bigger metropolitan cities. But they're also, unfortunately, these people are being shipped throughout the United States. So the problem is growing. It's growing exponentially. Conversations like this and bringing awareness to the issue is very important to us as an agency. And just to close out, and I look forward, hopefully we'll get some questions towards the end, but some of the simple things: if you see something, say something. And we encourage our partners. We have tip line information that'll be shared. We have an office here in New York between agents and task force officers. We're over 600 strong. We have 5 offices in the New York metropolitan area. It goes up to Hudson Valley and Long Island as well. We have an office right across the river in New Jersey. So staffing is not an issue in New York. Response is not an issue in New York. It's a lot of it has to do with partnership. So encourage those that you know and your partners, whether individuals, family members, religious institutions, hospital industry, education. There are resources. HSI is a resource to the community. If you leave this conversation with nothing else, we're victim-centric investigations. We have a victim assistance program specifically dedicated to victims across the board in any sort of criminal enterprise that we investigate. But specifically, we throw a lot of time, money, resources, and training to human trafficking and child exploitation. So we have the resources that we want to use. We want our partners to leverage us to help the community. And then also, probably one of the most important is that should people find that they were coerced into some sort of criminal activity during the course of their exploitation, which is very often the case. I don't want to say always the case, but very often the case, that should they come forward, they should not be afraid, and they should not fear prosecution from law enforcement. certainly not federal law enforcement. From a state and local perspective, I think I can speak with confidence. It goes the same, but certainly from a federal perspective, there should not be fear of prosecution. And then also for immigration issues, we are not looking to deport people who have been victimized. We are not looking to deport anybody who has come across the border and looking for asylum. There is a legal process to go through gaining access and legal status in the United States. But again, the current migrant crisis is exacerbating this human trafficking issue. So deportation should not be a concern for the victims at all. In fact, there are many occasions that we as an agency, some of our victims who have come forward and we've successfully prosecuted their cases. In some cases, and other cases, ongoing prosecution exists. We've used our immigration authority to keep these folks, keep the victims in the country, give them legal status, and actually bring some of their family members in and give them legal status as well, while we provide assistance, whether it's housing, financing, job assistance, therapy. So we are using, and this doesn't get publicized, our immigration authority for good to bring people into the country, rather than the current narrative that everybody's getting deported. So I look forward to the questions. I look forward to your partnership again. You all are a conduit to the victims, and the victims don't only bring us an opportunity to use our resources, but they also act as jump off points or leads for investigations to go after the people perpetrating these crimes. So that's all I have. If you have any questions now, I'm happy to take them. If not, I'll stick around until we're done. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach McCormack. And thank you so much for the partnership HSI offers us, the community. And we'll hold the questions until the end, just because I know that there's a lot of the participants on this call are directly working with the migrant crisis. So I'm sure they're going to have some questions related to that. So I'm going to just pivot over to hand it over to Daria, who will be speaking on the work that Safe Horizon is doing. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Hi, guys. My name is Daria. I'm a social worker with Safe Horizon's Anti-Trafficking program. So today I'm going to be specifically talking about probably a little bit more of, well, everyone's brought up some stuff about like victim-centered work, right? I do a lot of work directly with victims. It's the only work I actually do. So I'm going to be kind of giving you a perspective of maybe what to look for, warning signs, indicators, methods that traffickers use to coerce their victims, and so on and so forth. Next slide. So a lot of us have already kind of given a definition of what human trafficking is, but for all intents and purposes, I'll repeat it. Human trafficking is the force, fraud, or coercion to compel an individual to either work or perform commercial sex acts. Work would be what we call labor trafficking. Commercial sex acts would be sex trafficking, forced labor, lack of freedom. Next slide. So these are just some stats. In 2020, we found that there were 414 cases reported to the National Human Trafficking Hotline. And statistics often I find helpful to a degree, because very often with crimes like human trafficking, intimate partner violence, domestic violence, etc., you find that many people do not come forward, which is something that I think all of us have spoken about at some point in our presentation. And something I'll talk about later as well will be that some people don't even realize that they're trafficking victims, but I'll get to that later. So these are just some examples of the top industries that you may find labor and sex trafficking in. Domestic work would be maybe housekeeping, off the books work, hotel or motel based work, agriculture, peddling or begging rings, which may be organized rings of individuals who are forced to beg on the street for money, and that is labor trafficking, or restaurants may also have that. Top industries for sex trafficking could be resident-based commercial sex, which a lot of people ask what that means. It basically just means that it's operating through someone's apartment, home, property, that they're conducting their own like business, but in reality they're committing sex trafficking. Escort services, hotel or motel based, which could really be related to escort services as well, and online ads that could be coercive. Thank you. So, what makes a person vulnerable to human trafficking? So, we talked a lot about already, like immigrants being very vulnerable. And I know in my specific case, throughout this presentation, I'm going to try to give you some real life examples without using people's names because confidentiality, of course. And most of my clients that I currently work with are foreign nationals, and some have undocumented status. I actually am really happy to say that one of my clients recently received her T visa, which was a really great accomplishment over here. We also have a legal team, which I'll talk more about later. But anyway, so some vulnerabilities that make a person more vulnerable to human trafficking could be economic hardship, which is a lack of job or poverty, history of violence, trauma, sexual assault, domestic violence, war or conflict. When we say war or conflict, this could be that the person is fleeing their country due to a war or a conflict and may have been promised work or promised shelter or housing. And in reality, when they actually get here, these things are lies, which is the fraud section of tactics for traffickers, which I'll talk more about later. Then there's, of course, societal discrimination and history of marginalization, which we've all kind of touched on a little bit. So anyone that is societally discriminated due to their race, their ethnicity, their age, their physical and cognitive functionings, their gender identity, their sexual orientation, all of these people may have a more difficult time finding work. And so they are more easily tricked and trapped into a trafficking situation before they even realize what's going on. Lack of support systems, no safety net. Something I'll talk more about later, but I'll talk a little bit about now. When we say no safety net, we are directly talking about people that have maybe loss of contact with families. Maybe they don't have the financial means to have a phone and they can't contact their loved ones. Maybe their loved ones have passed. They've been isolated from their family, maybe due to um, multiple different marginalizations. And so a lack of support system can lead that they have nowhere else to go and they're essentially trapped in their trafficking situation because they physically do not have another place to go. Runaway and homeless youth, that's kind of is more like a vulnerable population that may have multiple overlappings of this. Oh, sorry. That may have multiple overlappings of this, such as they may also experience economic hardship, have a history of violence, also be a history of marginalization, and their needs for shelter, food, medical care could be another thing that traffickers hone in on to force them to stay in the trafficking situation. And foreign nationals, as I already said, often traffickers will use threats. In my personal experience with most of my clients didn't get help sooner because they found that they would bring. I had one client in particular who brought him and I were talking about like what were the means of trafficking, which means like how did he get in this situation? And he was talking about being provided a working contract, and it was promised that he would get um, sick leave, paid time off, all of these things, all in a written contract that he signed. So of course he's like, "Oh, we're gonna validate this. It's a written contract." And once he came here and started working, he worked in, I believe it was hotels, and he was noticing that his check was being depleted for whatever they said it was. He wasn't getting the right amount of hours. And so quickly it became very clear to him that they weren't honoring the contract, but due to fear, because he witnessed others of his coworkers going to their supervisor or their on the ground man, they called him. Um, oh, like we're not getting this, we're not getting that. They were always met with threats of, well, you don't have your papers, like we're gonna deport you, we're gonna call ICE, like you can't. So anytime there was that fear incited in him, so my client said that he never tried to confront his trafficker head on due to that fear. Next slide. All right, so this is a little part I put in here for this presentation. So as I said before, there's multiple different vulnerabilities that there are multiple different factors that can create a vulnerability to trafficking, and all of these vulnerabilities, especially homelessness, economic hardship, poverty, will be incredibly exacerbated during a natural disaster. Um, we see that obviously human trafficking victims all have very, very different experiences, but very often they have many overlapping vulnerabilities where they're coming from very similar backgrounds, very similar places of need. And so we're seeing that the types of vulnerabilities are rampant in the aftermath of natural disasters. Next slide. So this is just an example of the previous slide. In the U.S., we found that one of the largest labor trafficking cases in U.S. history was due to the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Because as I said, people were losing homes, jobs, loved ones. So that could be right, like economic hardship, poverty, lack of safety net. They may have lost their safety net due to a natural disaster. And so we find that it's very important to talk about human trafficking. And as our previous presenter said, even though it is an uncomfortable topic, it's something that maybe we don't even look at as a USA problem, because that's, also like a rhetoric that's spread around a lot, that human trafficking is like a worldwide thing. It's not here, but the numbers and the reports and my own clients very much so show that it is an issue, and it's a thing that we need to make sure we're looking out for. Next slide. All right, so how might you identify a human trafficking situation? It is incredibly rare that a victim will come to me and say, "So I've been trafficked." It's often we have to, in the intake process at Safe Horizon, we have to usually go through a number of questions and a number of evaluations before maybe the person even realizes, "Oh, that's what this was. It was a trafficking situation." So most of the public, like I has on the slide, most of the public don't understand the legal terms. And so much like domestic violence, it's often that's what's happening behind the scenes is what makes the work taking place a crime. Next slide. All right, so indicators. So this is maybe after you've evaluated some of the vulnerabilities. This is a little bit of like a step-by-step presentation almost of what we look for and what we hope others also look for. So some of these indicators would be references to sexual situations or terminology beyond age-specific norms or inappropriate dress for weather or situations. Now, these two are kind of grouped together, and when we say beyond age-specific norms, especially when we're looking at children, if children are involved in sex trafficking and they may be sharing knowledge of things that you can kind of infer is out of their age range, and that could be a sign of sex trafficking. Inappropriate dress for weather situations can be a way to hide one of the indicators below the bottom one, which is bruising or physical signs of physical trauma, scars, tattoos, bruises. That could be another indicator, kind of wraps in with the inappropriate dress. So malnutrition, food is limited or controlled, or drug addiction, both of these are seen in really both labor trafficking and sex trafficking cases. I find that in my clientele, a lot of them experience malnutrition, and a lot of them discussed that food was incredibly limited because it was very much so left up to them, and due to the fact that sometimes I had a client who said that he would sometimes receive a check literally with a zero on it, like he wouldn't get paid for the week for God knows what reasons. And so that would mean malnutrition because he can't pay for himself to eat food that week. All right, so let's see what else. We have references made to frequent travel to other cities, claiming to visit or cannot clarify an address. That is a really big one, in my opinion. I find that when I'm talking to my clients, they can't always specify exact places of, specifically with one of my clients that worked in construction. He couldn't always clarify. He couldn't even remember the addresses. And he said, "Oh, we did so much work that I don't really know." A lot of my clients that were in the hotel industry usually know the hotel name because that's a little bit different, harder to hide. It's usually in big bold letters on the front of a building. But yeah, so cannot clarify address is definitely a big one that we like to look out for. And the last one that I'm going to hit on is intimate partner is older and or controlling, and maybe within this there's a sudden change in their attire, behavior, or material possessions. Now, I like to specify here that just because we're saying that the intimate partner is older or controlling, it is a very big sign. However, we also like to make sure that we're checking our own biases, and very often we see that the partner that is the trafficker that is posing as a boyfriend, especially in sex trafficking situations, is not necessarily older or may not appear controlling to the naked eye or to one-on-one conversations with the person. So it's really important to note that not every trafficker will be an older male victim with a younger woman as their girlfriend. That is not always the case. I do currently have a client who uh, recently has escaped a sex trafficking situation where the boyfriend was around the same age, so there wasn't any older. And she said that he didn't display any signs of being controlling up until he started coercing and forcing her into um, prostitution against her will and threatening to call the police on her, call ICE. He's an American citizen. She is not. Well, now she has her visa, which I'm very happy about. But yeah, so it's important to note that while these are indicators, it's important to make sure that our biases are not getting in the way when we're talking about these things, because it's not always what we assume is going to happen is the case. Next slide. So like I said before, here at Safe Horizons Anti-Trafficking Project, we do a lot of uh, something that I spend the most time on would probably be the intake process with my clients, because there often is a lot of questions that you have to ask a potential trafficking victim to determine the situation that they were in. And I have some of them up on the board. Is anyone forcing you to do anything you don't want to do? One of the ones I ask the most often, that is usually one of the biggest indicators in my experience, is are you allowed to leave freely? Because that kind of control also really is like a dead giveaway. And yeah, for purposes of time, I'll move to the next one. All right, so tactics traffickers use in human trafficking. Again, I'll kind of speed through this. I have no idea where we are at time, but I feel like I've been talking for a hot minute. So I do like to say that usually force and fraud is what gets a client, one of our clients, into a trafficking situation. Coercion is what keeps them there. So force and fraud, force may be physical violence, kidnapping, sexual assault, confinement, burning, branding. And fraud, which is the most common one in my experience with my current caseload of clients, is that they were deceived and enticed promises or lies, lied to about working conditions, wages, benefits, and even these contracts are common where it's like workplace contracts where, oh, we have this written up code. Of course, it's going to be okay. But then they get here and realize that this was just a form of fraud. And coercion is usually then what ends up keeping them in the trafficking situation. Very often I see threats of deportation. That is one of the biggest tactics that traffickers use, one of the most common. Others may be threatening serious harm or physical abuse. Thank you. I see the little, you're doing great. We have time. So often there could be exposing prior arrests, like our previous speaker spoke about. A big thing that kept one of my clients from reporting was her own fear, incited by her boyfriend, about, um, oh, she's prostituting, so that's illegal, and so going to the police about that would get her arrested. So it's that threat there. Next slide. All right. So this slide I kind of tossed in here because I thought it was important to talk about domestic violence as well, especially in sex trafficking situations. These two can both mimic each other, get confused for each other. So it's important to kind of recognize the differences, the similarities. And something that I also like to say is that not all domestic violence situations are human trafficking, but a lot of human trafficking, especially sex trafficking, will involve domestic violence or intimate partner violence if the trafficker is the boyfriend or girlfriend or partner. So some points here that I find are very similar between the two is the economic abuse, which is the prohibited access to finances, limited resources, or maybe a small allowance. In one of my clients' cases that I've spoken about a few times now, she was given none of the money. He kept all of it for himself, her trafficker, and the way that she would feed herself or the way that she would house herself is through him. So she was very much so kept in that situation due to limited resources and economic abuse. Intimidation, harming the victims or other victims, children or pets, displaying or use of weapons. That intimidation is also something that a lot of my clients have discussed with me. One of my clients described the trafficker, or at the time posed against her boyfriend, would break into her house and say, see, like, it's so easy to get to you. If you disobey me or you don't do what I say, like, I'm going to kill you. And that's both intimidation, that's emotional abuse, and if it gets physical, can escalate to physical abuse, which would be shoving, slapping, as we all know what that means. Emotional abuse could be playing mind games, blaming the victim for their situation, humiliation, convincing the victim that they're the only one that cares about them, which ties into isolation. Isolation could be both physical isolation, which would be keeping them confined and uh, going with them to public places, or it could be emotional isolation, where isolating from families, or maybe isolation is they already have that lack of safety net that we discussed earlier. And sexual abuse could be using sexual abuse as a punishment or means of control. Um, and another point that I'd like to make before we move on to the next slide, because it ties into with this one, is that if a child is involved in any of these things, we as social workers or healthcare workers and volunteers, we're what's called mandated reporters. Next slide, please. So mandated reporting is it's a New York State law. Really, we have to abide by, and this is something that I always let my clients know beforehand. I always say, like, this is a confidential space. What you say here stays here. However, if you inform me that that you're going to harm yourself or others, or there's a child involved, I do have to report that. So reporting is during instances of suspecting child abuse or maltreatment. And like I said, we are required by law to disclose confidential information. So it's the one exception to the rule of confidentiality that we have here at Safe Horizons. And before we even work with our clients, we provide them a very lengthy packet on confidentiality, and they're able to specify whether they're okay with their information being shared with other Safe Horizon members, or if they also need legal assistance. We have a legal team, so our confidentiality papers also cover whether or not they're okay with their information being shared with the legal team, if that's what they need. And below oh, could you go back, please? Thank you. So below are the New York State Central Registry numbers. I'm sure some of you that work in social services have already seen these numbers, but always good to just stick them down there. Okay, now next slide. Thank you. All right, so points of access. So this is how trafficking victims seek help. Could you press the slide one more time? I think there's some info that hasn't popped up. Thank you so much. So top 5 points of access for help. We find that friends and family, them telling their friends and family, is the highest, because usually, like I said, traffickers prey on individuals with a lack of a safety net and a lack of social support, because that isolation is one of the key ways that a trafficker keeps a victim. And so informing their friends or family, if they do have means of communication, is one of the top ways in which individuals ask for help. The other 4 being law enforcement or criminal justice. This could be law enforcement either, um, in some cases, we find that law enforcement may start to investigate a victim and then see, oh, wait, this is a human trafficking situation, as our previous presenter discussed, and then they would not be prosecuted, and the case completely changes to a trafficking case. Health services, they could go to a clinic and maybe show some of those indicators that I was talking about earlier, maybe branding or abuse, signs of sexual abuse, signs of harm, and a health service member may report it. Mobile apps or social media, there is some power in that. They could, if they get a hold of their phone, or if they do have access to their phone, may be able to uh, ask, almost like call for help situation. And the child welfare system being the bottom of the top 5, because as I've discussed with you guys before, mandated reporting is that can be a way in which the system then learns, oh, okay, like, yes, a child is being harmed in this situation, but also their parent or their sibling is being trafficked. And so these stats are specifically from the Polaris Project. 2018 to 2020 was when we saw that friends and family were the main access point. Next. Thank you. All right. So how can you support a survivor? And this goes back to what we do and Okay, heads up 7 minutes. Thank you. I needed that time thing. So something that I do a lot in my work as a social worker, and previously I was a psychotherapist. Um, I find that client-centered practice is incredibly important when working with really victims of any kind of crime or abuse. So giving the client the ability to uh, kind of take charge in a way, which is takes cues from them. um, I don't like to sit there and tell someone, "Oh, you're a trafficking victim." Okay. Like that's not really how we're going to get anywhere, especially in their healing process when I'm providing short-term um, trauma counseling. I find that it's best to kind of help lead them to understanding their situation, ask them guided questions like we discussed before, and eventually they'll usually come to their own mark. I remember one of my clients saying that after we kind of determined, oh, okay, like this contract was violated, or sure, you didn't have any physical abuse or any threats made directly to you, but you witnessed it. And so that fear is what kept you down. And then him and I together were like, oh, okay, the fear is still a threat. Therefore, I'm still a victim of this situation. But yeah, so validate and normalize their feelings, communicating these messages of hope that I have on the side, which is letting them know that they are not to blame at all, and that they do have rights regardless of their status, and that they have a right to be healthy and safe. And another thing that I do very often is establishing safety plans. Luckily, most of my clients have been out of their trafficking situation for at least a year at this point, but I have seen and talked with my colleagues about other situations in which their trafficker, they may have escaped them 48 hours ago. So establishing a safety plan is incredibly important when discussing um, things with a human trafficking victim. Next slide. I'm gonna start speeding things up a little bit. We're almost done though. So these are some specific resources that Safe Horizons provides. So as a social worker, I'm in the social services department. And as I said, I provide case management and short-term counseling. The case management is listed here with housing, education, uh, family reunification, helping access public needs and basic benefits. And the legal team we have here is amazing. I love working with the attorneys, and they help our clients in T visa applications, adjustment of status or green cards. They may help them in court if an individual does want to uh, take legal action against their trafficker. And below we have our intake line, which we like to say usually takes 24-ish hours for us to get back to you, just because sometimes we have an influx of calls. So, we just ask that it takes a little bit of time to get back to you. Next. I'm going to breeze through this because I really already talked about it. This is a common timeline, which would just be what we do here at Safe Horizons. We find that at first we identify in the intake phase, and we make sure that there's no immediate safety concerns, which is the crisis management and stabilization, and they may or may not need legal services. And then phase two would be um, a lot of these things in phase two are with the legal team, like investigation and immigration status paperwork. Um, and what I do would be the detailed history of trafficking. And sometimes I write what's called a letter of support, which is something that a social worker writes for a client after evaluating them for trafficking, and they're working along with one of our attorneys or an outside attorney on their visa application. Phase three would be kind of like the phase out phase, long term stabilization, in some cases, sentencing of a trafficker, family reunification, or green card status. Next slide. Yeah, these are our final takeaways. These are some helplines, some numbers, and it's always really important to remember that regardless of what position you're in, whether you're in a social services position, you're in law enforcement, or you're in medical care, it's important to remember that a survivor of trafficking has endured severe trauma, and they always deserve client-centered support where they are trusted and they are valued what they are saying. And regardless of their status, they have a right to services. Next slide. And yeah, that's it. The next slide you could pop up as well is my contact information, and Eva is here with us as well. Eva is the training and outreach manager for our little team here. And yeah, that's both of our info. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. Very informative. Definitely going to be taking this information, and just to share with everyone at the end of this discussion, we'll be sending an email blast with all the helpful links and resources that our speakers have shared, and then also some additional links from other partners. So I just want to now take a moment to pivot into our Q&A session. So I'm going to open it up. So feel free to put questions in the chat, or feel free to raise your hand and we'll pick on you. So it looks like we have one hand up. So Io Harrington.
First, let me thank you, Racine and Zach, for putting together such a beneficial program, especially at this time in New York City. It is helpful to all of the work that each of us is doing. I have a question for all of you, and it is about treatment. So if a person is arrested for engaging in an act of sex for money, let's say in a motel room, in the street, wherever it might be. So if someone is found doing that, as opposed to coming to one of your agencies or to a nonprofit to get help, what is the difference in how the two are approached? Because it's considered a crime, yes, and a person who is arrested would have to go to a precinct and through a process, whatever that might be. What does she or he get in there that, using Racine's word, would pivot them into victim-centered assistance? Or does that happen at all?
I can kind of address that. It's a good question, and I can address it in part from a law enforcement perspective. We're a federal agency, so our investigations and our statutory authority and process for prosecution, so to speak, is different than the state and local level. But what I could tell, and I think the short answer to your question from a law enforcement perspective is that question will vary. It's going to be situational, based on the facts and circumstances for the individual. In New York City, for example, if this individual is arrested under these circumstances, NYPD does a very good job and continues to do a better job at helping understand the victim-centric or the victim-centered approach. And it's really through the course of interview and investigation that'll help make a determination on prosecution and or how they're going to navigate that scenario. I think that they do and they should be offering assistance, but this is also sometimes contingent on the level of cooperation, if you will, or transparency from the victim, because very often these folks, if they are forced into the sex trade, the manipulation, the deep manipulation that goes with that, and the threats and the fear that come with being arrested, we have to get to the place through resources that the police department and law enforcement offer to the person during the course of interviews and conversations, during those initial stages and those initial conversations, to help make determinations. Is this person a victim? How can they help us understand the circumstances of their victimization and the people who are forcing them to commit these crimes? So I don't know if that necessarily answers your question, but it's not a really clear-cut answer, because often enough, look, these folks, and we know psychologically they shut down. So they're either afraid of the people who are forcing them, they're afraid of law enforcement, they might be afraid of deportation. So all of these fear factors may prevent them from offering up information that would really help their cause, versus if law enforcement is left with no information, only other than you're soliciting sex, that becomes problematic, and really problematic, I'd say, for the individual, not for law enforcement. It makes it difficult for law enforcement to help the person, if that makes sense. Does that answer your question?
It does. Royce, can I just throw in one more quick question? Okay, so, and I see, Jill, you have your hand up, so apologies, many of them. As it relates to sex education in the schools, a lot of which is being removed from curriculums across the country, and have been used in the past as a first step towards educating children in an age-appropriate way about sex, about their bodies, and what is not acceptable, and safe space, and all of those kinds of things. As more and more states are removing that kind of information from the curriculum, do you find yet or at all that is contributing to the ability of predators to manipulate, groom, and manipulate children, and all that goes with that?
I can actually hop in on that as someone that has a lot of experience working with young people. The short answer to your question is absolutely. Taking away education always creates a higher level of victimhood. And in my presentation, when I was discussing indicators, when I said that an indicator could be non-age appropriate knowledge, this could also stem from a lack of education as well in what is appropriate and not. And traffickers can use that to their advantage. They can use the fact that it's become a taboo and it's become something that a lot of schools are removing. They can use that to their advantage, especially with children and young people. Uh, it can be used in a way in which they're manipulated because they don't have an understanding of what is inappropriate versus not inappropriate touch, because that's something that we should be and could be teaching from a pretty early school age, what is appropriate and not appropriate touch, because then a child would very quickly know if someone's manipulating them, or very quickly say, oh, this is not appropriate touch. And if a child doesn't have that education, or a young adult even doesn't have this education, I'm talking like 13, 14, because in some schools and a lot of youth that I've worked with youth 16, 17 that had zero sex education in schools. And that's well beyond the age that they should have had some form of education. And so the short answer is definitely yes, it increases the likelihood of victimhood, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I would just
Thank you.
add to Daria's point. Again, the theme of education, awareness, and partnership for an audience like this, as it relates to policy and advocacy for, New York City, for example, the Board of Education, that becomes more of a policy and an advocacy question. I think that on the silver lining, if you will, is private schools have a bit more autonomy with the education and awareness. So, for example, yesterday we did an outreach to an all-girls Catholic school in the Bronx, where we were speaking to the principal, and she adamantly said, we were talking about this theme of it's an unpopular subject matter, and she said it's great to have law enforcement in the room to talk about force and coercion, human trafficking, and online safety, because I think she, as a principal, as a private school, has the autonomy to invite partners in, where she's not necessarily bound by the broader curriculum or the broader policy for a public board of education. So, but it's only through constant outreach, constant communication, constant exposure and awareness to the issue itself, how rampant it is. And I think Daria also mentioned, this is not happening in the Philippines. It's not happening in Cambodia. It's happening in New York. It's happening in the Bronx. It's happening in New Jersey. It's happening everywhere. And so the more that point is hammered home, hopefully the more awareness and I guess augmenting or adjusting our sex education in schools for the children becomes more of a priority.
Thank you. Joe, I see you've had your hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Yes, quickly, this is for Daria. Thank you, Daria. Really appreciate and all the presenters, but this is very specific to what you see. You're talking about the indicators. How can someone who, how can we differentiate between the trauma that's experienced by people that aren't trafficked as opposed to people that are trafficked? Because some of the things that you mentioned are what's happening to people that have had to go through multiple addresses and are staying in some form of shelter. That was a big question for me because of the different kinds of where they're coming from. So whether they're coming from conflict area, whether they've been poor, whether they've been experiencing extreme gang violence and had siblings and family members murdered, tortured, etc. How does one deal with these levels of trauma to find the right resource for someone that was potentially trafficked as opposed to had all this other trauma and then was trafficked?
No, that's a really great question. Thank you, Jill. I mean, honestly, sometimes, so something that I personally will say for the work that we do is that our intake process is incredibly, uh, wow, what's the word? Just left my brain. um, what's the word?
Rigorous?
Say it again.
Been there.
I'm like completely lost it. Though it basically it's very like all encompassing. I was looking for a different word, but all encompassing works too. It's very all encompassing. We ask a lot of very, very specific questions. And I like to very much so specify that these indicators saying, oh, someone that's in poverty, that could be an indicator of human trafficking. It's not that simple. It's all of these factors that work together that can lead to or make a person vulnerable to human trafficking. And it's very important to evaluate everything because and for lack of better lack of a better example, when I was doing psychotherapy, um, something that I did a lot was obviously consulting the DSM-5, which is the um, manual of diagnosing an individual with some kind of mental health disorder. And in the DSM-5, there is for every single disorder on it's like over 500 pages. On every single disorder, there is a section called differential. And a differential diagnosis is essentially where you are evaluating whether this person really has the disorder that is in that category, or do they have the 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 other disorders that sound exactly like it. And it's a very complicated process because a lot of traumas, a lot of situations, a lot of mental health concerns, and a lot of trafficking situations overlap with different kinds of crime and different kinds of violence. So very often you'll find that someone that's a human trafficking victim is also a domestic violence victim, is also a victim of gang violence, is also a victim of many, many other things. And that differentiation really just comes from getting to know your client better and asking them more and more questions and having them share more and more of their story. And usually, the more that you get into it, you'll be able to start differentiating um, and hopefully then helping them find the appropriate resources from that differentiating. It really just takes time.
And if I may piggyback on that as well, um, we've seen, we're talking about socioeconomics or income or lower income or developing communities or people. A lot of or often enough, it has to do with leverage. So we've had cases where sextortion leads, grooming or otherwise regular relationships in otherwise normal or better off socioeconomic situations where a person is extorted or sextorted, where we've seen mothers have been coerced or forced to traffic their children. And maybe initially for financial gain, and it just a little bit of money because they were enticed. and next thing you know, there are videos of some sort of exploitation that are leveraged against this person, and now this person is forced to recruit more people like them to do the same thing. And again, it's not necessarily because they don't have money, it's because they're forced to, and they are now forced or trained or groomed to go recruit the next person to continue to perpetuate. So often enough, it comes down to leverage as well.
So thank you so much, guys. We're at time. So this concludes our discussion. I just want to thank our speakers and the organizations and agencies they represent: Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, Safe Horizon, and the New York City Mayor's Office to End Domestic and Gender-Based Violence for presenting today, and thank our guests for attending. As individuals affiliated with organizations directly affected by this issue, let's ensure that our awareness translate into sustained efforts to address and use these resources to combat the issue at hand. So we'll be sharing the links and resources discussed in today's session via email, so please look for it in your inbox. Again, thank you everyone, and have a great rest of the day.